I tell you, this is a very good panel. We have both migration and diaspora, and also there are so much diversity, internal migration, student migration, and theories also, push and pull factors, and there are gender issues. We have a very large diversity, even in 7 papers, you have different issues and um, subject also. So this is a very diverse range. So what we can do, we'll start with whatever the serial is there. We have 7 speakers and 2 hours. I think all are there. Anybody is missing?
Yes.
Hiram is there, Ansula is there, Pushpa is there, Nutan is there, Ani, Pranata, all are there.
Yes.
What we
Yes.
can do, we'll give around 12 minutes for each. 12 is okay?
Yes, sir.
Uh,
Yes.
I'll just take this. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Some call came. So 12 minutes and remaining time we'll have question answer. It will be better actually for you. So with this, I'll request Pranata Bhattacharya
Yes.
to
Yes,
present
sir.
your paper. 12 minutes. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair, for inviting me to this session. And thank you, Indian Sociological Society, SESIP, Hyderabad University. Well, my paper is related to Northeast India. Uh, Northeast India's forced migration issues are very stark. So my paper is related to issues of forced migration in Northeast India, addressing postmodern special demands and public policy. Uh, we know that Northeast India has been home to shifting people, cultivators, and migrants from the different states and different regions, from outside India, from inside India. So, different from different regions, if we look at Northeast India, we can see the diversification of the demography. First of all, Northeast India has faced cartographic reconfigurations from time to time, from partition, and then again for the globalization era, and forced migration, including in and out migration, remained a crucial factor in Northeast India. From 1990s to 2011, over I think 80 lakhs people has migrated. 80 lakhs people have forcefully migrated from their homes, and interethnic clashes in the western Assam and Tripura remain the major cause. An influx of the people from Bangladesh, Nepal, Burma, and sometimes their imaginaries of the leave spaces created trouble in case of forced migration issues. So the character of spaces which has been created in this situation, the sense of leaving space were actually lost by the people of Northeast India in two terms: either by the eviction due to different issues like natural calamities, or ethnic clashes or violences, or due to influx of the so-called foreigners to their own land, the way and it was like a demographic shift in the region. So the other problem lies in the creation of the spatiality, and space is not a given material reality. It is not even a transformed reality of homeland imaginaries. The space becomes a space becomes very prominent due to the direct intercourse among the people, among the inhabitants of the region, not from the historical time. It is also from the recent era of structural adjustment as well. For example, at the one hand, we can see that Bodoland Territorial Autonomous District of Pokrajhar. There we can find out Boros and Bengali Muslims were mutually dependent on each other in a very much agricultural economy, and Muslim laborers are settled in the Boro land as a laborers of the Boro owners of the land. On the other hand, they are having severe ethnic and communal clashes. and due to that their experience of lived spaces are very much disturbed. At the one hand, Bodos are claiming the land as their tribal land, which is political, which is part of their political or social identity. On the other hand, Muslim migrants, Muslim Bengali Muslims, who are actually migrated to the land for the bread and butter, they were also claiming the land as their own, because their imagination of the space, their cognitive mapping of the space is stating that that particular land is there. So rather than geography, space construction through mental mapping and living is much important, I think. The lived experience of Northeast India play a very crucial role in ethnic politics as well. The people of Chor area and River Basin got evicted due to floods. We know the floods of the Shubanshiri and Brahmaputra Valley, and many people got evicted due to that reason. So, especially we can see that many people are evicted from their own spaces where they have actually lived their experiences, their livelihoods, due to natural calamities. On the other hand, they were also evicted for the government projects. So basically, the concept of public policies are now coming here. Basically, the problem lies in the state's understanding of spaces. When state address when the Indian state addresses such problems of forced migration or the in migration or out migration in case of Northeast India, they basically see Northeast as a very much homogeneous land. But in reality, Northeast India is not a very much homogeneous land. It is heterogeneous in nature, and the term Northeast India is itself a very much umbrella term which involves lot of attributes. So basically, spatial attributes are basically ignored by this Indian state. And in that case, we can say that state is failed to understand the postmodern demands of the spatiality as far as northeastern forced migration is concerned. We can actually bring the ideas from Jameson and Harvey that cognitive mapping of the space is very important, and they are talking about a kind of new space. New space is not about bringing upon new trends or new ideas or new features into a particular spatiality. Rather, it's a kind of accommodating, rather it's a kind of juxtaposition of different attributes from time to time. Basically, the distance is getting suppressed here. This is a suppression of distance. So basically, the void is getting fulfilled quickly. So it is about how the space is getting filled rather than how the space is getting addressed. So when Indian state is looking at Northeast as a space, it is looking at this as a space of geoeconomics or geopolitics, not as the geocultural issues or not as the lived experiences or the cognitive mapping or the mental mapping of the people of the particular area. So there comes the geographical trait. There is a kind of geography versus space where we can find out that state is very much related to geography, and state is absolutely statist approaches absolutely resonates around the sacrosanct sovereign border rather than the people's idea of the spatial mobility. So as far as we can consider the cross-border cousins and their kinship-based economy, due to the globalization, due to the modernization process, due to the structural neoliberal structural adjustment, they were also forced to flee their spaces. They were actually evicted from their spaces in terms of their economy, in terms of their culture, because their culture and economy is intertwined. They're having actually a barter system of the transaction which is culturally attributed, which are culturally featured. So basically, they are actually getting evicted from their spaces, their lived spaces, their experiences of their mental mapping of the spaces. So basically, when when state is going to address all these problems, then state policy determination should be based on the spatiality. So just third space, and that kind of space should be considered through the mental mapping, and so that no one is left out while the policies are getting policies are getting figured out. So basically, we can find out public policy discourses are very important in this situation, and public policies should be done in a way that democratic permutation and combination can be ensured. In this case, I think G. Birmingham Powell's contemporary democracies is very relevant, because Birmingham says that such kind of policies should be based on uh, three basic three basic steps, that is control of violence, voter turnout in elections, and government stability. And later Lisford added that throughout the study, the overall quality of the democracy is also important. So when Indian government is responding to the situation, it is not really going through the so-called democratic, all-out democratic permutation combinations. It is rather focused on the very statist idea of structural adjustment. At the one hand, state is enforcing the sacrosanct border, cross-border people, their connectivities, their communications are hampered. On the other hand, state is talking about policies like connectivity projects, trilateral highway projects, Tamu Kalema Kalemo land project, PCIM economic corridor. So basically, things are very much economy or statist agenda oriented. So people's mental mapping, people's socio-spatial justice is missing here. So my argument is, basically, when we are actually addressing the public policy issues like connectivity, like telecom, the inner river projects, or whatever the public policy issues, then we should consider the spatial understanding. For example, we can say that number of dam projects are getting implemented, like Lower Subanshiri Dam and Brahmaputra Barak Valley Dam. So these dams are getting prepared for the better connectivity projects, but the issues of floods and issues of internal displacements remained unaddressed, and it is pathetic to see that Indian law and administration or the total governance system is not addressing these problems at all. So I rest my argument here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranata. I was about to tell you to cut short, but you perfectly stopped.
Yes.
So,
Thank you.
Northeast impact, Pranata explained how all forms of migrations are there. Natural calamity, two, government project which displace, you have ethnic conflict, you have the aspirational youth also who go for job. So all forms of push, pull factor, conflicting factor, all these are there to create a migration dynamic in Northeast. She also talked about how the economy versus all other economy that emphasizes on GDP, that emphasizes on the growth, and on the other hand, all other social, psychological, mental, cultural, all those, even political empowering aspect, all those things versus economy is creating again problem in Northeast.
Absolutely.
And this is where she is saying that public policy should be more participatory, where public should actually, they should participate the way they want. It is not the name of public, few people, representative of public can do.
Yes.
So that is very important, and from the very insightful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Now I'll request Annie Ereman. Annie has been very active. She is working on Armenian diaspora, but today she'll be talking.
I had a query. I am from technical session 1 and my number is 6. So am I in the right chat group?
What is your name?
My name is Ritu Talwar, 6th number, technical session 1.
Not in this, not in this.
So what is the link for the other technical session?
You are in Migration Diaspora group?
Yeah.
There you check, 2 links are there other than this.
Can you share that link on the chat, this chat?
Actually, I don't know, 4 parallel is going on. I got into this.
Actually, I also don't have that link. Can you help me with that link, please?
I'll tell Munir. your name is Talwar, huh?
If anybody else has that link, can you share that link for technical session 1?
Okay. Technical 1, na?
Yeah.
I think Anushama was there. She left again. She technical session 1. I'll
I'm having
ask.
that link.
No, you just wait here. I'll ask them. They'll forward me. Okay. Be here. Okay. So meanwhile, I'll give you what you can do. Can you give your number to me so that I can SMS?
I'll send you my number, sure.
My number is 981860.
Just a minute, I'll write it down.
Acha, you have written. Okay. Okay. So that I can. If you have Munir number, you can directly talk actually.
Okay, I'll write my number to you. Okay.
No, Munir. If you have Munir number, he is managing. Okay. So that will be better. Otherwise,
Some link has been shared, sir. Please check it out.
Okay. So
So it
now,
has come there.
okay. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for bothering.
No issue. I think we can share here directly. Okay. So what I can say, next is Annie Arman. Annie, you are here?
Yeah.
Okay. You can open the mic. Okay. Annie has been working on the Armenian diaspora. She's a student in JNU. And you start, Annie. 12 minutes.
Yes, sir. I'll be very brief. Yeah, I'm working on the Armenian diaspora, especially in India, and I'm dealing with such concepts like the identity, diasporic identity, as well as the home. But right now, my paper will be focused on the diasporas on the online platform, challenges and opportunities during COVID-19. So I will just go to my presentation now. I don't want to waste time. So currently, as we see, the world is facing crisis, and during this pandemic time, all these spheres of life, they are suddenly moving to the online platform and virtual networking platform, I would say. And in other words, the role of the internet is becoming very important. Though we can see that already in the 90s, Appadurai, he expressed the view that the electronic mediation transforms the pre-existing ways of communication. Hence, can you hear me?
You can hear, no problem. You can hear.
Okay. So then the focus here in my presentation is to explore how it affects the various diasporic communities also, as we notice paradigmatic shift in the activity of diaspora communities. Therefore, it becomes an important aspect to look into and to find out the challenges as well as the opportunities of such engagement by the diasporic communities amid pandemic. So just to start with, we all know that human migration and the formation of diaspora is not a new phenomenon. And historically, though, the etymology of the word itself comes from the Greek word, which means disperein, and it tells us about the nature of the migration to the diaspora to be a scattered community as such, due to a constant movement. But right now, what we notice in this current situation, and we observe the localization of the movement. And to my mind, that causes these communities to be isolated geographically. However, digitally, they tend to be more vibrant. And here, internet becomes a tool. At the same time, it is like a virtual, social, and political space which enables connection between various diasporic communities of the same ethnicity. Or in other words, I would say it is a new space of engaging. And in its turn, this helps to create the global within the local through the digital way of connection. Moreover, this online technique also helps to be in touch with the family members in their homelands. And of course, this helps not to lose their identity, and to have the sense of belonging to a certain community or to a certain nation. On the other hand, the sense of belonging is being enforced or reinforced through cultural engagement on the virtual space as well as a new trend during this lockdown. For example, I would bring an example of an Armenian band, soul band, which gave a live musical performance on Facebook to commemorate the 105th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And this shows that Facebook, as one of the social networking sites, currently it becomes another alternative virtual tool for cultural engagement as a way of reinforcing the shared sense of belonging to one single nation or community, but at the same time, the shared history through the, as I mentioned, through Facebook in this case. Though, as we may notice, in reality, these members of that community or that nation, they do not know about each other outside the virtual space. Therefore, the imagined community is being created, and the self-imagination of the community members occurs sitting just at home through digital means of communication and through various online media. In other words, I would again refer to Appadurai, who rightly notes that mass-mediated imaginary frequently transcends national space. Moreover, this virtual space also enables the expression of various ideas towards the policies which were carried out by the home state itself. And just like in case of the Indian diaspora, as I came across the one group on Facebook, and one of them was called, it was named like Indian Diaspora Thanks Modi. In general, this group is aimed at appreciating the recent policies or steps taken by the Indian government towards the various Indian diasporic communities. So as we notice, social or physical distancing, it becomes actual within this kind of activities, and in fact, under these conditions, it shrinks. And something which is very much desired in pandemic situation. However, I would like to add that there is one problem which is arising when we deal with this, the affective and the emotional realm of the community, of certain diasporic community member. As far as it becomes neglected, and it's not even visible within the online communication. And I believe this has to be taken into consideration, as various diasporic communities, they have different emotional thinking, even and to their homeland or home, as we may say, and that depends on the origin of a certain diasporic community, or the formation of the circumstances under which it was formed. So here I would like to end my presentation. Thank you. Sir, you are muted.
In fact, the online platform, what Ani mentioned, it made many diaspora alive because of online tool. I can quote one diaspora called Basque diaspora, which is a Spanish community, and they explored who is Basque, other Basque, this, that, through Facebook. Okay, so online platforms are becoming very engaging now. People share their stories, their emotion, their poems, and all this, and that become a identity creator, and over time they become important for diasporic identity. So it's very important when she's connecting with COVID, especially. COVID-19 brought, now people cannot move physically, so online mediums are very active. Even today's conference we are doing online. Similar things happening to diasporic communication. Families are now in Zoom and Google Meet and all this. So online platforms are becoming very important during COVID. So thank you, Ani, for very insightful talk. Now I'll request Nutan. Nutan is there? Nutan.
Yes, Dr. Sahu.
So your presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sahu. My paper presentation has been titled Loss of Freedom and Life Chances for Laborers in the Face of COVID-19. This paper proposes to study the constrained situations faced at different levels by various sections of people, but especially focusing on the migrant laborers. Now, it should be remembered that these workers are alienated not only from their home, but also alienated from the system. We should also discuss the limited freedom of mobility, hygiene, secure and safe transportation available to certain sections of people who find themselves helpless in front of the draconian structure. We also need to see the huge disparity in the extent to which freedom of opportunity and life chances people have during the coronavirus pandemic. I would also like to highlight the importance of community and how in the era of individualism, community and community services have helped many families adversely affected by coronavirus pandemic. Towards the end, I will also like to talk about the labor laws and dilution of these laws amidst COVID-19. Now, I will begin this presentation talking about the Janta Curfew, which was called on 22nd March 2020 by our Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And by this time, coronavirus had already hit the news bulletin and had become a debatable topic in most conversations. Mr. Modi, our Prime Minister, announced the Janta Curfew from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. on Sunday to curb the spread of the virus that had already claimed 4 lives and infected at least 169 others in the country. People were not supposed to leave their homes during this 14-hour Janta curfew. It was an onset of a long battle against the coronavirus outbreak, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. On 24th March 2020, the Government of India ordered a nationwide lockdown for 21 days, limiting movement of the entire 1.3 billion population of India as a preventive measure against COVID-19. These constrained situations have continued over many phases of lockdowns. These lockdowns compelled and changed the pattern of work structure. Online work and work from home model was being encouraged for most sectors. Many private sectors also cut down the payment of their employees by 30 to 45%. The scenario seems grim for most people, but the worst affected scenarios or sections are the lower class people and wage laborers. The situation for the wage laborers are grave, as most factories and local manufacturing units had come to a standstill. Even transport system was not working. There were no means of transportation for these migrant laborers. Interstates buses did not operate and neither the trains were running. Now, as the government had called for the lockdown, a lot of jobs were at stake. Many migrant laborers who worked at construction sites away from their native villages found it difficult to survive without wage and proper shelter or food. Away from home, it seems that lockdown is only the beginning of misery for India's migrant laborers. India's estimated 140 million laborers not only faced the threat of the coronavirus, their economic survival was also endangered. They were far away from the slogan, "Stay home, stay safe." Neither were they home nor were they safe. With all the transport system shutting down, these migrant laborers started to endeavor on a journey which would soon become the headline for national television. Masses of migrant laborers, including men, women, and children, were seen walking thousands of kilometers towards home. There are many concerns regarding the life chances of these workers. They no longer have a job, no savings, or little savings, and very less likelihood of finding a source of income in their native place. One should not forget that these laborers had migrated to cities and industrial places in the first place in search of better livelihood and life chances. With the present scenario, these laborers are forced to come back to their native place. And they are finding it very challenging to secure a job in these places. Now, I would like to take time to mention about a young couple who was stuck in Tamil Nadu in a place called Hosur. And the wife is about 6 weeks pregnant with their child. Both the husband and wife are daily wagers and they work at the construction site. They were running out of money, food, and hope to get back home. Now, more than their own security, they were concerned about the medical facilities, care of the child, medical tests, medicines that are essential during this crucial time, which were not being availed by the young couple because of the lockdown. Now, this young couple had been working over there for the past 4 months when the lockdown was announced. Prior to that, they were working in Golconda for 8 months. Now, the site where they were working offered them wages as well as food. Now, 1 month into the lockdown, it was announced that they will no longer pay them, nor will they provide them with food. For a month, they were only being paid and no food were given to them. Now, once they lost their jobs due to lockdown, they could hardly survive on their little savings. So it was then that they decided to come back. And with the transport system being shut, their only ray of hope was boarding one of the Shramik trains, which would bring them back to their place, that is Jalpaiguri. Now, the husband would go to the inquiry office every day, talking or asking about the trains that would reach them to their destination. Now, for the first few days, they found that there were no Shramik trains that would take them to their destination, that is Jalpaiguri. However, it took some time, around 14 days, before they got to know about a Shramik train that will take them to Jalpaiguri. Now, once they reached, the train took around 3 days for them from Hosur to Jalpaiguri. Now, once they reached their destination, they were quarantined for 14 days in the quarantine centers. Now, once they were out of the quarantine centers, they would go out for search for jobs. Now, what they found was no one was willing to give them jobs. on the basis that they had migrated back to Jalpaiguri. Now, the employers of these tea gardens would wait them away, saying that they should further home quarantine themselves for 10 to 14 days. Now, this whole situation is very grim, and it has taken a psychological effect on the couple also. They have very less savings. They also have to cater to the medical facilities, the medicines, which they're finding it very challenging. So on one hand, of course, they're glad that they have returned home, but on the other hand, their life chances here is darker than what it was previously. Now, I'm going to talk about the importance of community and grassroots involvement. Now, in this place, Jalpaiguri is highly populated or mostly consists of the Adivasis whose ancestors were brought here from Chota Nagpur area as bonded laborers. Now, this population is extremely poor, and most of them are daily wagers who work in tea gardens. Now, in contemporary times, many of their children are the first generation learners who are studying in different colleges in various cities. They have moved out for pursuing further studies. Now, amidst the lockdown, when the children have come back to Jalpaiguri, they find that there is loss of jobs. And thus they start up with a volunteer work under the banner name of Madait, which means help in English. Now, during the lockdown phase, where the entire population was without any livelihood, these children contacted and pooled in resources to feed as many as 400 households. Now, this has not been just one person's contribution, but an entire community or members of that community. Resources were shared, financial assistance was provided, and food chains and supplies were structured so that families in need would be assisted. Today, we must remember the notion of Ubuntu and practice it consciously in our everyday life. The values of being together, sharing resources, well-being of others, generosity and tenderness needs to be cultured and cultivated. Now, the changes in values, of course, is going to take time, but the pandemic has brought drastic changes in legal and economic sphere. What we're going to look into are certain labor laws in India and what are the changes that has come around. What we find is that the governance or the government is no longer looking into this. The government is giving out a message which is clearly saying that the workers have to work under the whims of the factory owners. There is minimum or no check in the labor market, and the state has become a mute observer. The government would not interfere in any industrial dispute, and that laborers cannot form trade unions or go to labor courts. Further, the picture gets darker as there are things like the new factory need not provide toilets to its employees, nor do they have to provide better work conditions such as lighting or ventilation. It is all being done in the name of few foreign companies which want to relocate from China. They are saying that this will boost investment and generate employment. However, it seems it's a utopian, unforgivably dull picture that the government has painted. There are prominent changes in labor laws in India which needs to be highlighted. The first thing that I would like to talk about are the changes that these changes in labor laws will apply to both the existing businesses and the new factories being set up. Secondly, I would like to mention about the Madhya Pradesh government suspending many labor laws for the next 1,000 days, which is around little more than 3 years. There are few important amendments that should be mentioned. The employers can increase the working hours in factories from 8 hours to 12 hours and are also allowed up to 72 hours a week in overtime, subject to the will of employees. Besides that, the registration of the factories will now be done in 1 day instead of 30 days. Further, the license of these factories should be renewed after 10 years instead of 1 year. Industrial units will be exempted from majority of the provisions of Industrial Dispute Act 1947, which means that the organizations will be able to keep workers in service at their convenience. Now, the sad part is that the Labor Department or the Labor Court will not interfere in the action taken by the factories and industries. Apart from this, contractors employing less than 50 workers will be able to work without registration under the Contract Labor Act 1970. Now, most relaxations to new industrial units should be also highlighted. The new industries are exempted from the provisions of right of workers. According to this right, details of the workers' health and safeties at work were ensured. They were also entitled to a better work environment, which included drinking water, ventilation, provision of creche, weekly holidays, and interval of rest. They are further exempted from the obligation of maintaining registers and inspections, and can change shifts at their convenience. Lastly, the nail in the coffin, the employers are also exempt from penalties in case of violation of labor laws. Now, it is a very grim situation for daily wagers and laborers, but how this pandemic era further affects their life chances and their freedom to minimum dignity to life still needs to be unfolded. With this, I bring my presentation to the end.
The concept Nutan was using Ubuntu is very important in the current context where actually we thought COVID will unite people and they'll have a very, community feeling and they'll have a very human feeling. But it's actually leading us somewhere else. If you see the global scenario or even local scenario, how they deal with the labor, how they deal with the migrants, you find very inhuman treatment actually, even though the crisis is a time to show solidarity, it is showing more inhumanness. That is where she's talking about Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a concept in Africa where people actually feel at home everywhere they go. They can drink water anywhere, they can feel at home. So that is community take the responsibility of the individual. That is the concept and very inclusive living. So, and she is also, she critiqued the, both employer and the government policies in the current context where actually they should think more about labor because tomorrow it will create more problem for even the employer also. If today they mistreat the labor, tomorrow they cannot revive their economy, they cannot revive their factory. It is, but they cannot see the future. They can see only whatever immediately they can do. That is what happening. And Nutan is saying you should be very pragmatic, very inclusive, very futuristic, and very human. Thank you, Nutan. And now we'll go to Pushpa. Pushpa, your paper. Pushpa is there?
Hello, sir.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
yes.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. Today's my topic is.
Pushpa, be louder a little bit, or you come closer to computer.
Hello, sir.
Okay.
Today's my topic is dynamics of social institutions in the era of pandemics, family, religion, and civil society. Today I am going to present on this topic very briefly. COVID-19 has affected every aspect of life around the world, from individual relationships to international relationships. As the societies and governments are trying to fight against this disease, the disease is affecting badly on families, governance, education, religion, and economic conditions. The former US ambassador to NATO, Nicholas Burns, described the impact of COVID-19 as a serious as a world war. In this paper, I am going to discuss briefly about the impact of COVID on the families, religion, and on the civil society. Um, as we all heard, today's most famous and important slogan is "Stay home and stay safe." Is it applicable to all? Because in almost all countries there are millions of people who don't have any proper and protective shelter, which we described as home. COVID-19 has different impact on the well settled families and the families of financially low or not well settled. The families who are in the comfortable zone, they are staying in their home safely with their families and enjoying variety of food and describing about the family love and bondage. But what about the low income families, families who are depending on daily wages income? They are affected very badly by the economic problem caused by COVID-19. There will be one threatening point that they may suffer or not by the COVID-19, but definitely they are suffering by hunger. This is one point on which we must throw light that is violence against the woman. There are many complaints reported about domestic violence during this pandemic. By the social media, we are also familiar with this fact by the news and newspapers. Um, in the lockdown situation, when many men lost their freedom to go out of home, at the same time, the women are also lost their freedom and uh, their personal space, whether they are working or homemakers, they are also lost their freedom. The sudden changes is become the cause to increase domestic violence. Other problem is related with education and child marriage. As um, uh, Indira Madam told today's morning session, many studies shows that while the schools, colleges, and educational institutions are closed because of this COVID-19, the rate of child marriage is increasing. This is also again it is a violence against women, and there is a report published in the newspaper that the lockdown and staying at home may cause population explosion in the future. Unavailability of family planning equipment is also one of the causes. Uh, when we come to religion, the COVID-19 has impacted religion in various ways, including the uh, cancellation of the worship services of various faiths, cancellation of pilgrims. Many churches, mosques have offered worship through live stream. Several branches of Christianity have suspended their daily and weekly religious rituals so that people could remain in their houses and social distancing be followed. Not only Christianity, Hindu religion and the followers of Hinduism also suffered a lot in the lockdown because Hinduism is known for its festivals and rituals. Then many festivals were celebrated cheerlessly from home only. The prayers, puja were also affecting badly. The Islamic religion is also affected. The mosques were closed many days. The religious gatherings that captured um, headlines in the early March become super spreader event in the COVID pandemic. Officials in Saudi Arabia are urging Muslims worldwide to delay making plan to perform their Hajj. The public health measures for safe burial practices have already crashed with traditional rites and the consider proper and dignified respect for the dead. Then when we come on the impact of COVID on civil society, government responses to the new coronavirus pandemic or distributing civil society globally. Globally lockdown physical distancing measures are conforming people to the homes and upending their ability to meet, organize, and advocate. Many civil organizations have been forced to put planned activities on hold. Others are scrambling
Puspa,
to
one
shift
minute,
their work online. More worryingly, yes, sir.
last minute. Conclude your
Uh,
presentation.
uh, Okay, sir. And there are many, of course, not civil society initiative or internally, and not all civic groups will play constructive roles in the crisis response. At the current surge in the civil organizing, nevertheless provides an opportunity to highlight the vital role of civil society in sustaining vibrant and healthy communities. Thank you, sir. Thank you, organizers,
Okay,
for
Puspa,
giving me the opportunity.
very insightful talk. In fact, all the religious institutions, whatever their practice for 1,000 years, 100 years, because of COVID now they got changed. Religious gathering, rituals, and all these have changed. Even family she's talking about that has changed. I just want to say, Puspa gave a quotation of some American president that World War One, actually, it is like COVID is almost similar to World War One. Okay, I can say World War One was good in the sense it united the countries. Okay, but COVID-19 actually disintegrated the country. No country is, caring the other country citizen. It is actually working against humanity, COVID-19. So there is a difference, though the tragedy is almost similar, but it's a very difficult time, COVID-19. The world is not united now. Unlike that World War One or Two, you can say some countries are fighting, but many were, after that they realized and they established organization like UN. Okay, so with that, I thank you for a good presentation. Before I go to Ansula theory, I'll just make that Iram, you have two ID actually, you have to go out and come in again. Otherwise, it will create echo. Iram,
Yes,
Iram
sir.
has, you have
Yeah.
two IDs. So you go out completely or remove one ID. Otherwise, whatever.
Okay. Sir, actually, I was having network problem, so that's why I've logged in into two devices, so that at the last
Okay,
moment there won't be any
no
problem.
problem. Okay, now it is no echo. I usually thought that two wide echo. So before that, I want to announce few things. We have 3 papers left, and we have 3 papers left, and almost 40 minutes will give to 3 papers. And anybody want to have a question and all, you please write in the chat box, because even if you leave, I can read out the question to the speaker. Okay, all are requested to write in the chat box. And now I'll request Ansula theory.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear.
Yes, I would like to share my presentation as well so that it'll be easier for everyone to follow.
Okay.
Oh, okay. screen sharing has been disabled. That's okay.
I think the organizer has disabled because of some this thing. 1 minute. If I can do.
Yes, please. Thank you.
I don't know where it is, the option.
It's right
Can
at
you
the
manage? Can you manage?
Yes,
You can
yes,
click
that's okay.
only.
Yes,
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
that's fine. No problem. So good evening, good afternoon. My paper is titled Features of the Mobility of Indian Students Studying Abroad During the COVID-19 Pandemic. I will be basically assessing the student experience of having to come back from foreign countries due to the pandemic, and I wouldn't go so much into the statistics of it, but mostly on their experiences, which data for which I have gathered through a survey. So I don't need to explain the prevalence and the impact of the pandemic in detail because we are all facing it today. But I would like to mention that this has affected students in a very different way because around 98.5% of the student population, of the world student population, are now studying from home because colleges, schools, and universities have been shut and online education has been introduced. And there's been a lot of talk and debate on whether online education is a feasible option, but whatever the reasons are, it is the only option available to us today. So the reasons why people doubt online education is due to the quality of it, the workload increases for people who have children, for parents who are working, they can't leave home, and the monetary impact on universities, etc. But one of the main impact of online education is on student mobility. Now, because all the classes are online, students no longer need to go to universities. And because of restrictions on travel, etc., students have now prepared to stay back home and study from their homes, which is obviously their only choice. And for especially for students staying abroad, they prefer to do so from the safety of their homes because they would like to be with their families at this absurd time, and it's also cheaper for them to go back home rather than stay in foreign countries where the standard of living is obviously higher than it is in India. Now, I will go into the survey part of my research. So the the goal of my survey is, like I said, to assess the experiences of these students who have had to come back or who are staying abroad but are confined to their homes. And I would like to briefly mention the target audience of my survey. The target audience is, of course, these students, but there's also a limitation that pertains to this target, is that my respondent size is not big enough for drastic generalizations to be made. Furthermore, I am focusing on students that go abroad. Therefore, they belong to a certain socio-economic level, and these students can afford abroad education even without scholarships. So they are from the privileged section of society, and therefore and since I will be focusing on international travel and not domestic, therefore the respondent pool of my survey becomes even more limited. There are a few sample questions that I would like to mention, such as I have asked them if they have come back to India, and if they have come back, would they have preferred to stay back abroad, or do they like the fact that they have come back? And I've also asked a few questions regarding the future of their education and the future of international education in general, such as, do you think prospective students who would have otherwise pursued their education abroad will now prefer also in India? And another one, such as, what are your thoughts regarding the future of your education? The results of my survey can be divided into objective and subjective data. Objective data is the level of education. Most of my respondents belong to a higher education level, such as the last rungs of their bachelor's and or their master's. And their countries of education where they're currently pursuing their education are China, USA, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, and Czech Republic. 100% of my respondents have said that they are currently pursuing online education, and there's a 50-50 divide between those who have come back to India and those who have stayed on. The subjective data of my survey is based on what they are experiencing, and based on their experiences, what they regard the future of education is going to be like if the COVID-19 situation is to continue for the foreseeable future. The first question I asked them is how they feel about coming back. And surprisingly enough, a lot of students have said that they would have preferred to stay back if the situation would have warranted it. And the reasons given for this is because they feel disconnected at home. They feel dissatisfied. They feel like their experience abroad wasn't satisfactory enough, that they could not do justice to their education. And they also feel very pressurized because online education means more work, more assignments, more tests to compensate for the lack of physical meeting. The reasons that they have given of why they came back range from severe to mild. Severe ones being a lot of them faced visa expiry, so they had to come back or they would no longer be legal citizens. Not citizens, but other reasons are that the place that they were staying in became the epicenter of COVID-19 at that time, so they had to come back for safety reasons. Others have said that their parents forced them to come back because they were very scared about their health and their well-being, which is pretty obvious. Now regarding the future of their education, will they be willing to, this is mostly for prospective students who are planning to go abroad in the coming year or next year. I asked them if they were willing to take a course from a very renowned university, even if it is 100% online and even if they have to do it from home. Most of them have said that they would not prefer to do so, that they would rather study back in India rather than study online in an abroad university. Another aspect of their future education is regarding the fee structure. So I asked them whether the fee structure should remain the same if online education is to continue, and 75% of my respondents said that no, the fee structure has to change because online education is not the same as offline, since they don't have access to the university resources and the networking that they would normally be accessible to them. So these two questions tell us that if online education is to continue for the foreseeable future, universities will have to make some big changes regarding their curriculum, regarding their fee structure, regarding the target audience, and etc. My analysis of my data is that the level of education of my respondents is high, so they are seasoned students, especially for those who are in the last rungs of their bachelor's. They have lived abroad for a while now, so they have adapted to it. They are used to that life, and my respondents also come from countries heavily hit by COVID-19. For example, US has 3.5 million cases at the moment. UK has 293,000 cases. China, as the origin of COVID-19, has 83,000 cases. And Czech Republic, although it doesn't have the same amount of cases, its curve is rising. And right now it has 13,000 cases. So I have also noticed that people from the most heavily hit areas are the ones who have come back, such as the US and the UK. Most of them, if if they do not have any other option, are willing to continue their education in India, but since they are now used to the level of education, the quality of education abroad, they would try their best to see that to make sure that their education continues abroad, since a lot of them also want to pursue their professional careers abroad. Therefore, they do not want that break, and they want to keep on continuing their education and also their profession abroad. I yes. Okay. Most of my respondents are very unsure about the future of education, of their education itself. For instance, if more students now decide to stay back in India and not go abroad, then that would mean that Indian universities and educational institutions will face a higher influx of students. I asked my respondents if they thought that Indian educational systems were ready for this increased influx of students. However, they were very unsure about the effects of this, and they could not answer, since majority of them take the option of maybe and I don't know. So this unsurety can be attributed to the fact that not enough time has passed. Universities have only been closed for 3 to 4 months, and this is not enough time for us to ascertain the long-term impacts on students and on universities itself. And maybe this is why they are very unsure about the future of their education. The future of international education, when I asked them, most of my respondents banked upon the fact that things have to normalize, because unless there is a vaccine, unless offline education becomes safe again, they are willing to continue with online education, but they are very adamant about the situation normalizing, because for a lot of reasons, such as for the reasons that they're given in India's case in particular, that Indian universities and students alike are not prepared for online education to continue for a very long time, since a lot of students do not have access to fast internet.
Ansula, you have 1 minute.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah, so they caution against offline education, but are banking upon the situation normalizing extremely soon. And a lot of them have also said that this online education has also made universities and students adapt, and the ways in which they have adapted is very interesting to see. So in general, they're very ambiguous about their future, and they also agree that coming back home is necessary, but they also consider it very unfortunate, since they would have rather stayed abroad and continued their education. And the aspect of student mobility are extremely multifaceted, and this is just one aspect of it. This is the experience of students, but a lot of further research is needed to provide a more comprehensive understanding of the whole phenomenon in itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Ansula, and I must say this is very good topical, and it's affecting all of you. So
Yes.
I just want to give one example. So to create one hobby, you need around 6 months time. Okay. So now the hobbies of the people have changed, and hobbies have tremendous impact on economy, manufacture, everything, service sector. See, now people cannot go out to shopping mall. So it will have impact on several sectors. Okay. People cannot travel. That will have impact on both service sector and manufacturing. So, and as you know, before COVID also, our engineering graduates are 70% of them unemployed. Okay. So now again, we want to know that what will be the emerging skills. COVID has perished so many skills. You cannot see photographer, videographer now. You cannot see big sports now. You cannot see big malls now. And so many things, your hobbies have changed. Your consumption pattern has changed. So many things change. So my point is, what will be the emerging skill? And on that basis, maybe the educational institutions will reinvent. Okay. So this will be again, you may find many traditional subjects, programs may not even have any demand, either in USA or in India. So this will be a very precarious situation for the education. And what we call demographic dividend, now it is a very dangerous time for us, whether this young population of India can really help us or it will be a disaster. So very insightful and very topical. So now I'll invite the next speaker, Iram Fatima. Iram, 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Dr. Iram Fatima, and I'm an assistant professor at Ramanujan College of University of Delhi. The topic of my paper is a study of feminist diasporic sensibility in Chitra Divakaruni's The Mistress of Spices. Diaspora literally means to scatter or sow across. The Oxford English Dictionary traces its usage to a reference in the Old Testament to the dispersal of the people of Israel across the world. The classical definition of diaspora, based on the Jewish model, presumes that dispersal is due to forced exile from a homeland to which people desire to return eventually. Recent usages of diaspora refer simply to the migration of an ethnic community. William Safran suggests that diasporas are characterized primarily by the relationship between the dispersed people and the original homeland to which they hope to return. Diasporic literature involves the idea of a person or a group of people from their homeland to an alien place due to various compulsions. Diasporic writing mostly becomes a response to the lost homes, leads to issues such as dislocation, nostalgia, survival, and cultural change and identity. My research paper aims at exploring the element of feminist diasporic sensibility in Chitra Divakaruni's The Mistress of Spices. The Mistress of Spices is a novel which has adopted a more complex strategy for portraying diasporic identity. It has depicted diasporic sensibility in general and feminist diasporic sensibility in particular. Thus, the threads of feminism and diaspora are interwoven in the story. The Mistress of Spices is a magical tale of herbs and spices. In this novel, each spice is described with the help of a song. Each spice has some special properties. There are certain rules and restrictions associated with each spice. The Mistress of Spices is one of the best known works by Chitra Divakaruni. This paper explores the diasporic elements. Chitra Divakaruni has a great importance in literature. She writes to unite people. Her aim is to destroy myths and stereotypes. The themes of Divakaruni are explored in the novel The Mistress of Spices. She writes for the people and published novels including realistic fiction, historical fiction, magical realism, myth, and fantasy. She makes use of fable in order to explore the various kinds of problems encountered by immigrants. In this novel, the first-person narrative has been adopted from the perspective of Tilo or Tilotama, who has trained to extract the essence of the spices and make them to alleviate pain, solve problems, and help people live better lives. The deliberate gendering of the word to undercut the power associated with mastering supernatural powers is to be noted. The Mistress of Spices is a magical tale of love and herbs. Women are the center of her fictional world. Her illusion of world of women is realistic, credible, and authentic. She wants to explore the identity of women in the society. She used to write with her immigrant experiences. As being an Indian American writer, she herself knowing that so many Indian American authors have achieved such high levels in the combination of their dreams and passions. Her plots feature an Indian-born woman torn between new and old world values. She endeavored to combine her knowledge of the migrant experiences. Her prose is effective and it stays in the heart of the readers. It gave a wide range of view with which a struggle for identity amongst women and to develop critique of patriarchal stretches that organized the life of Indian diaspora. Her immigrant experiences spells in her writings and evokes the Americans to see and understand the richness of India, Indian culture and Indian spices, and how they create magic in solving the problems of Indian diaspora. In The Mistress of Spices, Devakaruni presents the stores of spices as the meeting point of all the immigrants. She not only sells the Indian spices to the needy customers, but also inspired them to share their personal woes with her. In this novel, each spice is described with the help of a song, and each spice has some special properties. There are certain rules and restrictions associated with each spice. Tilo, being a mistress of spices, has to adhere to a very rigid regimen and model of conduct. She is from personality touching any of her customers or involving in a personal level. Further, she has to remain in the spice shop always and should never leave its premises at any point of time. And if she breaks any rules, Tilo would have to face the consequences for these actions by suffering some sort of mental pain as ordained by the spices. But gradually, Tilo's association with many of the regular customers and her secret forbidden love for Raven shake the solid forbidden of the spice world in which she inhabits. In The Mistress of Spices, a woman in similar circumstances brought about partly by her colonization is cut off at once from her entire support system of family. At the end, such painful thinking and trying about different things, she decides to leave the relationship. Tilo tries to convince the amicable balance of life through a fine process. She is able to solve the problems of her customers with the help of spices. Tilo claims about the spices have the power to revolutionize life. The novel validates women empowerment through articulation of their desires. As with the protagonist in the stories, she argues for recognition of women's full control of their bodies. Once Tilo is in touch with their sexuality, she can no longer assuage others' pain or even see into the future, but she can live the life of young women. She must leave her domain, the beautiful organized spice store, in order to fulfill desire. The Mistress of Spices has a blend of diasporic elements. The term diaspora in Greek origin means scattering or dispersion. Diaspora also refers to the movement of the population from its original homeland. Indian diasporic literature with its presence all over the world. It is one of the most talked about and discussed topics in the world literature today. Generally, diasporic elements deals with alienation, displacement, nostalgia, and quest for identity. It also reflects the immigrants' experience that comes out of the immigrant settlement. The changing destination of homeland with nervousness is the most important themes in diasporic literature. This novel adopts a more complex strategy for portraying diasporic identity. Devakaruni makes use of fables in order to explore the various kinds of problems and circumstances that are encountered by the immigrants. An immigrant is a person who comes to live permanently in a foreign country, and it is a division between the realistic world combining the myth and the magic to create a fable of her. The novel has adopted a more mature structural configuration to explore the diaspora. Each chapter contains a little picture about an individual, about a cultural encounter. The stories are then woven together through the novel. The sublets, shade caught, and developments depicted. A variety of cultural codes and icons are recognized as Tilo weaves her tapestry of different lives, becomes implicated in the lives of Jaggi, Mrs. Ahuja, and Geeta, naming a few. Through the storytelling of Tilo, the form of the fable is effectively used here. The fabulous world of Tilo. The mistress gives a surreal quality to the novel. The structures overlap and specific histories coincide. The advantage of this literary model is that it continually confounds the category of realism. Therefore, the events in this novel cannot be processed as information. The novel refers its theme of magic realism, lengthy dialogues, and the characters that touch the hearts of the readers. As New Yorker Review magazine comments, quote, Karani's prose is so pungent that it stains the page, yet beneath the sights and smells of this brand of magic realism, she deftly introduces her true theme, how ability to accommodate desire enlivens not only the individual heart, but a society cornered by change. Unquote. The Mistress of Spices gives plenty of sources on diasporic grounds. It enhances the Indian glory into the past and the present world, at the same time portrays the problems immigrants face as others. The magic realism of the East, the exotic land viewed by Western eyes, gives a glance of the Indian beauty of spices and their magic. There are various diasporic aspects which we come across in the novel, like changing the names of characters as Tilo Chamma becomes Tilo, Jagjeet becomes Jaggi. All these give us a view of the diaspora. Another basic and foremost aspect of diaspora is multiculturalism, which can be noticed through the lives of Geeta, Jagjeet, and Mrs. Ahuja. The novel reflects the struggle for identity amongst women and to develop a critique of patriarchal structures that organize the life of the Indian diaspora. And Devakaruni's her own immigrant experiences speak in her writings and enable the Americans to see the richness of India as well as Indian spices. The novel carries a picture of how Indian immigrants can create magic in solving the problems of Indian diasporas. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Iram. And I tell you one thing, diaspora literature is as diverse as diaspora.
Yes, sir.
Because we know especially the Kuli diaspora who have Virmitia and all, they have gone. They didn't have access to the mother country for centuries through TV or whatever. Okay. So
Yes, sir.
the loss they experience is different from the loss the new diaspora experiencing, because these are very privileged class in USA.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and their loss is different. They just miss a nostalgic place, but they also gain huge things. Whereas the old diaspora, they struggled here, they struggled there, and the literature coming out of that, if you read the B.S. Naipaul or any Mauritian writer or any
Yes, sir.
other, they are different type of loss, and that we can call classical diasporic literature. Okay. And
Yes, sir.
you have brought out many magic and all the spices and all which are associated with Indian exoticness, and this diaspora also, they think India like that only, and they don't want India to change also. Some
Yes,
of the
sir.
diaspora. So very insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Now we'll go to the last speaker, Dr. Arundhati Mohanty. She is student of University of Hyderabad, now faculty in, I don't know the exact place, but student of sociology. So may I request you to present your paper, Arundhati Mohanty, madam. Are you there? Please unmute. You can unmute from your side. 1 minute. Unmute again. Okay. Okay.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, yes, I can hear.
Hello. Thank you, Professor Sahu.
We have our teacher also.
Yeah, our teacher. It's a first webinar, and that too, having my teacher with me, the biggest inspiration. And dear participants, my respect, regards to all the organizers. At the outset, I am a student of Hyderabad Central University, and I am presently with Bhadrak Autonomous College, Bhadrak in Odisha. My paper is on revisiting the push-pull theory in the present pandemic phase. It's a very common, well-known, tested, time-tested theory, which has been given by Everett Lee way back in 1966. So I would like to focus upon some of his factors, pointers. I'll be talking within 3 levels, and Professor Sahu requests you to please warn me for my timing. One will be on the general demographic transition, which has a lot of impact on the economy, globalization, and the power factors. The second part will be the theory itself, that is Lee, and taking back to Ravenstein. And third, of course, in my abstract, which I have and would like to bring it to the national level and to the webinar level, is the Odisha, with special reference to Ganjam, which is very much in the news of the rising spike in cases, especially in the district of Ganjam. And through my little humble attempt, I would like to draw upon the link of Gujarat, Surat with Ganjam, which because of my thesis, because of my doctoral work, which I worked on the migrants of Odia laborers in Surat. A little bit on the introductory part, that is the demographic transition is always marked by economic globalization. The COVID-19 has also brought a new platform, that is globalization of the pandemic. Disease has also got globalized from the local to the global, or from the global to the local. Both ways, we are now all connected. At the same time, it has also brought into picture the work, the labor force, the problems of wages, and it has highlighted the powerlessness and the non-empowerment of workers in spite of explosion of wealth. They don't go together, rather. That is, power and economy here at this particular point of time aren't going together. Way back in 1995, Gardner had said that migration is always a relation of power at different levels. Today, this paper would like to look upon this from that angle also. That is the power between different states, between the rural and urban areas, between the migrants and the non-migrants, and between the individuals within a family, that is the members, who is earning more, who is earning less, who has migrated out, who is at home. So this organizational architecture of the global economy has brought the equations of power again from the global to the little hamlet, to the little villages that are now flooded with the migrant population. Going back to the Lee's theory, which I have brought into, which I would like to revisit, so hence I would like to talk a little bit on the Lee's theory rather, where before Lee, it was in 1881 that Ravenstein, and later in 1889, he contributed to the theory of migration and brought it to the center stage, that it is always the origin and the destination and the obstacles. It was Lee for the first time who brought the word distance. He rather highlighted the distance factor. And the recent pictures in the media, starting with the print and the audiovisual, or wherever we see the shocking of pictures and visuals of sprays on the migrant workers en route their home, the distance they covered in cycles and walking, again highlights Lee's theory that distance is not a very small factor. It is rather quite a big factor. So Lee gave this theory in 1965, and he said that the decision to migrate is extremely important. That is, the decision factor has been decided on the basis of the place of origin, the destination, the different obstacles, and the personal factors. So here again, this COVID pandemic time, the way the migrants have rushed home, the exodus of the migrants has brought into picture the decision factor, the perceptions of the people, that why suddenly they had to literally flee, why they had to flee the place where they had gone with so much of interest and so much of attraction. In this lockdown phase, the push and the pull factors have slightly, I think, going for a reverse trend. Rather, they are going to change their equations. What was a push factor once upon a time suddenly became the stay home, stay safe, my village, my homestead land, my Bhita Mati, in whichever way we say, it has suddenly become the pull factor, in ignoring the economic disadvantages. So the stay home, stay safe, the pandemic has again changed the pull factor. Coming to the push factor, which the urban centers, which were once the pull factors attracting urbanization, better educational opportunities, welfare activities, the glamour, etc., suddenly turned their back and they suddenly have become the push factors. And one such small instance is that on 28th of April, when the lockdown was still on, and 5 buses with 288 Odia migrant laborers leave Surat, and without any medical checkups, and they also get a green signal just to move. And we are all aware of the different obstacles that these buses had to go through and the accidents, etc. After which the Indian Railways were brought into force and then started the entire chain of bringing them back home through different means. In this background, I would like to say that the push-pull theory of Lee is now put on test, again put on a pedestal, that it is now getting into another phase of changing its trend, where the urban becomes the push and the rural becomes the pull factor. After that, what next? Coming to the aspect of Ganjam, that is the major district in Odisha, which has the maximum number of cases. As on today, 2 hours back, it was 180 plus positive cases. And suddenly it is becoming a very highlighting factor that why Ganjam? Although Odisha itself is witnessing a spike in cases. I would like to share some of my field experiences, which may be too amateurish at this point of time, but still the living patterns within the urban settlements, when it is coming, when one thinks of Surat, the way they stay near the places of habitation across the railway tracks, away from the mainland of the city, although it is a diamond city, it's a textile city, a city of riches, the way the Odia migrants, the migrant population mostly stay. I say Odia because most of them are Odias, otherwise there are other migrants also within that area. They are no way connected to the city, to the infrastructure, to the facilities of an urban life. And the most important aspect is the reason for rushing out. That is again needs a bit of pondering, because we flee rather when there is a threat to my life or to my survival. That recalls Maslow's theory of needs, that is the basic needs are needed first, then comes security, and then we reach to self-actualization or whatever. So when the basic needs are in question, then these are the thoughts that one's life world starts coming. So at this point of time, this paper would like to explore that it is not just the quantitative statistical numbers that should suffice, that these are the number of migrants who have come today, or these are the number of migrants, as I have that 98% of the migrant workers are from Ganjam in the last 12 days. So it is not this statistics that is now going to be more important. We have to delve into the qualitative data rather, which I have put in my abstract also, that it is the life world, as Hazel and Habermas have discussed in phenomenology, etc., that we need to delve into the psychological aspects, that why do they feel so insecure to leave their place of destination and come back to the place of origin. And that the same migrant who had left home with flying colors and lots of hopes again comes back, and the way the person is going to be received back in the family. Earlier, he was the earning member. It was the money that made him popular. It was the money that gave him a pedestal. The question now arises that he is at crossroads with his life world. What next? What next? Whether he'll get the job back, whether he'll go back to Surat. Why does he feel so insecure? So these are some of the questions, and the media and wherever the literature we read, it is written as stranded migrant workers. That defines the place called home and the place called the public, the safe haven, where a person feels emotionally secure and has a family to look forward to. So these are the lockdown questions. These are some of the aspects that we need to look into when we are talking about a migrant who has come back, who had gone with so much hope and is again back to his village, to his extended family and his acceptance. I think that should be, I hope I have kept the time limit, sir.
Dr. Arundhati, in fact, when we study about theory, we always think no theory is sacrosanct. They're all subject to change over time and situation. So when Max Weber coined this, spirit of capitalism connected to Protestant ethic, and only Protestants are reached that time, and he identified that certain values, ethics are there. That's why they could be rich. They could, have rational thinking, writing skill, and all those. But today, if you see, Hindus are also equally rich, Chinese are also equally rich. All the traditional society, if you find, they're also equally rich in USA and UK. So the theory got changed because new dynamics came. Similarly, COVID-19 also 19 it has opened new dynamics, and the push-pull factor that theory of Ravenstein now is subject to change. You really brought out very important issue of how the pull factor. They both are there now, but the proportion has changed. The dynamics has changed. So it is no more economic which pull the person or push the person. It is something else other than economics. And thank you so much for bringing out this issue, very important issue. Now we have about 18 minutes. So let's have a good discussion because we have very rich, subject we presented, all of you. So we'll open the house for few questions and answer. If you have any question, you can raise your hand or write in the chat room. I can ask directly, or the presenter can read also here. I think there are already some questions. If you can read something, there is a person called Sarath Kumar. He asked question to everyone, like the reverse migration. He's saying, is it reverse migration? The term is too early to use. He's asking question to everyone, because even Ansula talking about students are returning, Madam was saying push-pull factor, reverse is happening. So many of you talked about migration. People are coming back to their home. So some of you can answer this question, whether it is too early to use this term, reverse migration.
Can I try, sir?
Yes, you can.
Yes, I do partially agree, because already there are different groups who have reached out to the villages to convince the people to go back. And already for the Punjab harvest, the migrant workers from Bihar have already left, and they are already working in the farms of Punjab for the harvesting season. So definitely it is a phase of transition, I should say. Too early to say it is a reverse migration.
Okay, so another two presenters who talked about both side of student migration, Ansula talked, and also Pranata also talked about forced migration. You can throw light on these two, this question.
I agree with Sam. I think it's mostly situational more than a concrete decision made on the parts of migrants or students. So I think they will be going back as soon as it's possible to do so. So I don't think using the term reverse migration is good right now, because it's, first of all, too early to tell, and second of all, it's not exactly reverse migration, because they will prefer to go back as soon as they can.
Okay, Pranata, you have any point?
I think the term reverse migration, I think it is too early to use, because whenever we are talking about reverse migration, the so-called homecoming of the so-called migrants who has left their places or their spaces. So it is a matter of understanding, it is a matter of time that we have to figure out that exactly what space they were living. So what were their spaces? Because idea of geography, the only sacrosanct border, I think it is now getting kind of elusive, and I think the concept of space is very important. So which space they are actually they were living into, that should be considered before we talk about reverse migration. So I think this is too early to use this term.
I have a point to make here. Actually, reverse migration is not new concept. It is happening in Kerala every year. You see, Gulf migration since 2011, it is increasing actually reverse migration in Kerala, if you see. Because Those who have gone there, many of them became old. And also there was a policy called Nitakat, which enacted, and they didn't prefer the outside people. So there is a increasing reverse migration happening already. But the states like Northeast, Bihar, and maybe Orissa, those are very new to migration. It is not new to have reverse migration, but otherwise it is happening in Kerala because many are old people and they cannot go back, and they come back. So this is what happening. Student migration reverse was something new. What Ansula was saying, it is very new because they didn't have situation like this. So this is my point. I just want to request Professor Bhatt if you want to give any remark on any of the presentation you had.
Thank you. I have not been for all the presentations. I missed some of them. I think, yeah, first 2, 3 I missed, and last 1 or 2 I was here with you. Thank you. Yes, I'm also wondering whether you can use the word reverse migration, because we know returnees, migrants returning home. So this is not returning home. This is only a temporary phase, and they may go back. As you were talking about the students issue. I think one of the presentation was about the students returning home. Now, if these students are returning home, they either, if they have technologically endowed and get reconnected, they will have an online continuity. So they are halfway, their mind is in their institution wherever they are, and they may be at home until the situation is improved. That's the other part. And therefore, reverse migration has to happen only when there are resources in the other side coming up, really. I recall the Japanese, when Japan became, a global economic power, when Tokyo assumed a greater global center, you find all Japanese returning. It's a reverse. It's a going back because they have the opportunities here to come back. So that attracts them and they go back. So that is the reverse migration. Whereas in this case, it's only a temporary phase. Maybe the idea of going back. In most of the cases, perhaps it's going back. In some cases now, if you see recently the new legislations in US, do I have time? Another 1 or 2 minutes?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We have.
The recent judgment, because it went to the court, the recent judgment, because all these Microsoft and some of these big industrialists went to the court saying that don't stop students in Princeton, Harvard, and so on. Students were asked to return back home if they don't have a physical class there. If it is only online, then they should get back to their places. This was Trump's decision, and it was conveyed to them. And everyone went on, both these institutions as well as industrialist universities went to the court, and the decision is that, no, don't send the students away. They are there. Maybe they may not have a class, even if it is online class, wherever they are comfortable, let them be there, and we should not be sending them back home. So this was the issue. So the students' migration back home is only a temporary phase. They will be either, if they are endowed with, as I said, technology, they will have online linkages and online classes, or at some point in time, they hope to go back to the institutions where they are. So it's yet, again, to use the word reverse migration, the migration has to have a economic point, which you mentioned about the labor returning. If it is a reverse migration, they should have something there, a better opportunity back home, then they will reverse their direction of migration. And that will be a pull again back home because of the economic opportunities and so on, which happened in, as I said, again, the case of Japan. And yes, I was there for Avinderji's presentation. And I was just wondering, when they think of returning back from Surat, is it just because the problems have come up, so they take individually the decision, or whether she has some data or she can find out whether it's a decision collective, number one, or is it a decision there is a leader to take a decision why, and whether it's a temporary sojourn for some time until things improve, because they are in a certain specialized works there in Surat. So returning back home, maybe only on a temporary
Yeah,
phase.
yeah, definitely. I'll
Whether they're thinking of back.
can I
So,
can I
sir,
answer?
can I say?
Yes,
Yeah,
Annie, you can come.
Yeah.
Let Annie also speak. Yes.
When we are talking about this reverse migration, first of all, we need to think reverse migration in regard to which community, because not all migrant groups, they had migration from the place where they were to their home, and especially settled communities, they were not at all migrated, or they were not forced to migrate to their home countries because they were already settled, and wherever they were, it was already their home, let's say like that. So not all groups or migrants, or I don't know, they migrated. So reverse migration is not, we cannot talk about it and include all the migrant groups in that.
I think, but I do agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. So anybody has a point, or we're getting close to?
Arundhati is responding something. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Arundhati.
Please.
Yeah, sir. When it comes to the migrants of Surat, because I've seen them in Hyderabad also working in the hotel industry, certain very highlighting factors in their working life and their living patterns and the way they, as sir asked, whether it was a group decision or an individual decision. The way the word herd community is being used now, it is actually the way they live also. They live together. The educational level or the is quite low, and the way they are treated, the way they manage their lifestyle, many of them suffer from very lingering lung diseases also. Surat has a Odia school. It has its Odia theatres. It is a mini Odisha in itself. It has its political leaders who are constantly in touch. And recently, last year, the flight also started from Bhubaneswar to Surat, only for them. There is a lot of money among a few, but the powerlessness factor and the way they are like faceless in the industry, in the textile sector, is definitely very heart-wrenching, although one has to be very objective. And the way the wages are given, because they are just put in numbers, not even their names, they are just put in numbers that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what they do is every 6 months, they go for a rotation. They take one room and 20 people stay together, and in rotation, 12 hours they sleep, the other 12 leave for work if it is 24 or 10, and that is how they may manage the day and night shift. The fooding, everything is too low, and they spend the least for themselves in Surat. But particularly when it comes to Surat, the way they maintain their lifestyle, they go through a lot of diseases. That could be another fear factor propelling them. And the major part of the money is sent home. More than, I should say 80% of the money is sent home. And they do not keep any savings. They do not maintain any bank accounts also. They do not have anything to look forward to. They eat and live and again come back, wrap up everything, because they are faceless in that textile industry. They are counted in numbers. Suppose 5 leave, then the owner asks that let 5 enter. Years back, when I traced them in the railway station, when they get down, they live in a level of psychological illusion and a fragmented personality. They change their clothes, which is very literally worn out. They put it into their suitcases and take out new wares, shoes, etc. And they want to give a picture to the world that we are definitely happy. But inside, the story is that there are many suicide cases along the train lines, and majority of the pharmacies in Berhampur particularly have told many times that it is for the lung and tuberculosis along with HIV that is maximum among the Surat migrants. So they are almost caught in a web of their own poverty within the place of destination, And because of the leaders also, it is like two factors working at the same time. The leaders who have come to power, who want to use the power and highlight them, as well as it is the workers themselves, the way they manage their lifestyle that propel the fear in them to rush out. That's why one of the, within this small time, that's where I could do justice
Okay.
to the question.
So hope we all made. We are closing very 5 o'clock. So Nutan, anything you want to say? 1 minute. If you want to say anything in 1 minute, we are closing. It's close to 5. Otherwise, I'll conclude. I think Nutan is not listening. So what I listened from Dr. Arundhati and all others, country like India, we need, it is a migrant sending country, whether it is international migrant or even the most states in India, Bihar, Orissa, Northeast, all this, they're sending migrants. Kerala is sending to abroad, from within India, we are sending to Kerala. So this India is experiencing lots of migration, whether it is inside or outside. So, but the major issue is we don't have proper information management. We don't know what is happening to them. Many are undocumented. But thanks to COVID-19, at least COVID-19 brought the data. At least we know this many people are affected, whether migrant, they're undocumented or what. So at least we have the data. So this is the beginning of, having proper data management, and we have a long way to go. Now the crisis is more on us because student population, the youth is unemployed now. Youth is a uncertain future for them. So there is a lot many things to do for us. And we think all of researchers like you should throw new light on this and give some kind of insight to policymakers. And it is very important that you all engage in one or other aspect of the migration, very important area of migration. And thank you all once again. Prepare a good paper and send to the organizer again. And thank you all for, I felt very happy with your all presentation and very insightful. And I thank the organizer also to give all of us opportunity for me to moderate, for you to present, and all the participants are participating so well. We started in 29 participants, we are now 41 towards the end. So this is the success of our panel. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Arundhati.
Thank you.